Thank you guys for joining us. I see that there's 58 people in this room, which is awesome. My name is Jenny. I'm going to be moderating the discussion today. We are talking about public banks and public payment platforms, a very cool, new, cutting edge type of idea that is emerging on the left. We're getting a few different perspectives today from New York, from Chicago, maybe elsewhere as well. And so without further ado, I will hand it over to Amara, who is going to introduce herself, and we'll do a round of intros. If you can talk about, just what your involvement has been with public banking or public payment platforms so far, what state you're in, how long you've been organizing for it, just basic info, that would be awesome.
Sure. Thank you for serving as moderator for this conversation. I also want to thank the organizers of the Statehouse Futures Conference. It is a great space where some incredible ideas are being discussed and shared. So I'm very excited to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joining for this discussion on public banking. My name is Amara Enyia, and I work in the space of public policy, but also in organizing. Right now, I'm the managing director of a transnational organization called Diaspora Rising, where we work on issues of concern across policy areas for the global Black diaspora. I'm also the policy and research coordinator for the Movement for Black Lives, which is a national organization of a couple hundred community-based grassroots organizations that are working on many, many areas of concern. And so public banking is a part of the framework of what we call our vision for Black lives as part of our economic justice platform. But I've been working in the space of public banking, or at least advocacy for public banking, for a number of years, going all the way back to my earlier days as an organizer in the city of Chicago, where I am based. I started working and learning about public banking, maybe it's probably about a little over 10 years now. And at the time, it was still a very nascent idea. In Chicago, it was actually not an idea, but I had the privilege of being able to connect with a few other people who latched onto it and really saw the value, especially as those of us who worked in the space of public finance and really looking at cities and their solvency and some of the financial and fiscal challenges that we had, and knowing that there had to be structural mechanisms that we could employ that could actually address the challenges that we face. And so I started organizing in that space and really just learning and then sharing that information. I partnered with the Civic Lab and Tom Tresser, who's also in Chicago, hosting many, many public meetings around the city in different neighborhoods on public banking. Had the privilege of getting involved with the Public Banking Institute, and I'm now on the advisory board of the Public Banking Institute. And they've been doing amazing work over the last several years, just really to advance this idea, to ensure that the momentum that we have, they've largely been helping to create that to where we're really seeing some tangible progress across the country. So I'm, again, very excited to be here sharing about this work. And of course, with my colleague, Bob Hockett, it is always a pleasure sharing any space with him. So that's it.
So I'll say the same. I mean, first of all, it's a great honor to be with you guys. With Amara, we are indeed colleagues on PBI. We've been fighting the fight for a good long time, and it's an absolute joy to be with her here. It's a great joy to be with Jenny as well, a colleague from DSA here in NYC. So I'm basically in heaven at this point, working with two fellow travelers with whom I've been working for quite a while. And the subject, as you guys know, is one that I'm quite enthused and passionate about, like you guys. And so it's always just a joy to be talking about the subject and kind of getting the word out. I've also been working quite a bit, as I guess you guys know, with Assemblyman Kim, with Ron, who will be joining us shortly, on a particular version of digital public banking that we've been pushing for a bit. Largely thanks, I think, to the visionary legislative leadership of Ron, and this is the inclusive value ledger that we'll be talking about as we proceed. As far as the sort of longer term story is concerned, the longer term history, I think it's very much like that of Amara. We've just, I think, both been interested in the sort of utility or public utility nature of banking as a phenomenon for a long time. And I think similarly scandalized by the way in which private sector entities have managed to kind of co-opt for profiteering purposes and exploitative purposes by bringing into private hands what really ought to be a public function and should always have been a public function. So here is the latest venue of the struggle, I guess you could say, a centuries-long struggle between those who have understood the public service or public utility nature of banking on the one hand, and those who have been trying to kind of keep it, to themselves, with hands on the other hand.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. So we are still waiting for Ron, and we'll get him to introduce himself. He is definitely a trailblazing lawmaker here in New York State. I work for another Assembly member, Marcella Matenis, and they are colleagues, and they work together, and it's awesome to have just two amazing legislators in the same legislative body. But okay, so Amara, you kind of talked about, how public banking is a part of the Black Lives Matter kind of economic justice platform. And so to kind of ground this discussion for people who might be maybe exposed to this idea for the first time, can you talk a little bit about why this is something that is worth pursuing? It sounds very theoretical. We're all familiar with banking services, but why is it important that banking is public as opposed to private? And then in a more tangible way, what are the benefits that we could see? Would we see more infrastructure being built? Would we see more housing being built? How would this kind of change the lives of working class people around the country and different state legislatures? If you can break that down for us and how you see it, and then would love to hear your take on that as well, Bob.
Sure. So it is the reason that it is part of what we call our vision, which undergirds all of the work that we do, is because we emphasize the need to move away from attempts to individualize what are actually systemic and structural problems. We see this trend where we know that structurally our cities and our states and frankly our country, in terms of spending, in terms of how resources are allocated, we know that there are structural problems with that, in particular, the banking and the finance sector. And so when we talk about the fact, for example, that in Chicago, one major private bank, JP Morgan Chase, I'm just gonna say it out there because the data's out there anyway. One bank, JP Morgan Chase, lent more in one predominantly white neighborhood in Chicago than in all of Chicago's Black neighborhoods combined, predominantly Black neighborhoods combined. That they lent, for every $1 they lent to a white potential homeowner, they lent 8 cents to a Black potential homeowner, and maybe I think it was 12 cents to a Latino or Latina homeowner, potential homeowner. These are just the facts, and this is from 2020. So this is not from 1965. This is not from 1980. These numbers are from last year. So when we talk about issues of home ownership and wealth building, the ability to build wealth, the ability to have resources to support individuals and families, it is tied to intentional policies enacted in particular by these major private financial institutions that have actually locked out opportunities for wealth building for Black people and for other people as well. But in this instance, specifically for Black people. And so when people say, oh, well, why don't just buy a house, just start a business? I mean, we see a similar trend in business loans, right? It's not that easy. And instead of individualizing it, because the person just needs to try harder, we actually have to point to the practices and policies that have been in place, especially in the private banking sector, and in some instances facilitated by a government that have actually created these outcomes. And so our goal is to attack things from the root and not just to call out the disparities that exist, but to say, what is the alternative that's better? Meaning, we know that we have to dismantle unjust systems. We have to call out institutions that are part of the problem, but it's also a question of what do we do instead? And that's where public banking comes in. We're not by any stretch saying that this is the panacea for every ill in society, but it's a huge part of the economic disparities that we're seeing and economic justice issues that we're seeing, because it plays into everything from household income to the ability to own a home, to the ability to start a business, to all of the flow of capital into communities, which is a huge issue. And so this is a place where if we can make some inroads, if we can utilize the power of public banking to mitigate the harms created by a private banking sector that caters to and has allegiance to shareholders and profit, that we have to move in that direction. And we see it as part of a suite of economic tools. So everything, when we talk about the cooperative economy, or the solidarity economy, we include public banking in that, because we think these are the building blocks that are necessary to build an economy that actually reflects our values. So that's why it's a part of our national work.
Awesome. I just want to see if Ron, are you able to unmute, or no luck still? No. Okay, let's turn it over to Bob real quick. And I'm going to see if maybe we can call him in. So Bob, so why do we need public banking? What are the benefits that public banking would provide that we just can't even imagine, or we don't have today?
Yeah. So first of all, I'd like to fully endorse everything Amara said. I mean, these are very important, very profound points that seem to go underappreciated and under discussed. What I could say by way of complementary remark, complementary with an E rather than an I, right? Sort of supplementary remark is, just to sort of contextualize a bit in sort of slightly broader political economy terms, every society that is productive, or as Amara put it, that is wealth building, that is basically building wealth, basically produces more than it can consume, right? And the question then becomes, what does it do with that surplus, right, over and above what is consumed? Now, if you had a society that was actually working as a cohesive unit on behalf of all of its members, it would presumably use that surplus to build yet more wealth to keep improving the material lives of all of its members, right? If you think about a family, for example, a cohesive family, when it's bringing in more income than it's actually eating in the form of dinner or lunch or breakfast and so forth, it plows that surplus back into what you can think of as family development, right? More education for the kids, maybe a more comfortable home, maybe sort of more enriching sort of educational experiences like visits to museums and so forth. It's basically using the surplus as a kind of common pool, a kind of common asset to better the lives of all of its members. And one would hope that a society would work that way as well. The problem, I think, that we face in kind of contemporary exchange economies of the kind that we live in right now is essentially that we sort of outsource, as it were, the deployment of the surplus to private sector institutions like Chase, right? Like JPM Chase, as Amara referenced. And when Chase is doing the deploying of social surplus in this way, it's not particularly concerned with bettering the material conditions or the material lives, or for that matter, the cultural or spiritual lives of the citizenry as a whole in the way that a family would, or that a smaller cohesive society might do, right? They're in fact doing the deployment on the basis of a completely different set of motives, namely how much money can they rake in for their particular shareholders, and of course for their executives, who are oftentimes exploiting the shareholders just as the bank is exploiting the citizenry at large. So one way to rectify that and to sort of communalize, as it were, the social deployment of social surplus is to recognize the essential public utility nature of banks. And in effect, this is the way, of course, this is the sort of ultimate way of addressing those structural problems, those structural structural wrongs and injustices that Amara just so eloquently referenced, right? So if we think of this in terms of sort of social surplus and who gets to deploy social surplus in order, again, to build more and more wealth, broadly understood in the way that Amara was describing, then it's kind of easy to see where public banking fits in and why public banking is not only kind of a good idea, but an imperative, a justice imperative, right? It's absurd, right, that this is all done by the private sector. There's simply no reason to think that a few small number of private sector bankers are going to deploy social surplus in the interest of society at large. And we've seen again and again that they don't. And not only do they not do it productively, but they do it destructively, as every crash shows you. So it's not even that there's a lack of a net positive that we could have had. In other words, it's not just that we're foregoing social wealth growth opportunities here, but we're actually destroying and undermining wealth that's already been built. As Amara has in effect sort of referenced, at least, think of how much of the wealth of this country was built on the backs of slave labor, right? Unpaid labor. Not only did those laborers and their descendants not enjoy the fruits in the way that they should, but a lot of it is just actually being actively destroyed by the same bankers who continue to exploit us. So if we really want to address the systemic problems and the systemic injustices, it seems to be a core thing. One of the first items on the agenda has to be to republicize, so to speak, this public function known as banking.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I think I have Ron here on the phone with me over here on my retro office phone. Ron, do you want to give us a few words of intro, who you are, what's your involvement with public banking, the inclusive value ledger, what exactly it is, and how it all ties together. We'll see if this works. Thank you all for your patience as we get creative. And I hope you heard that, Ron.
Yeah, so thank you, Jenny, and I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes.
I apologize. I'm having some technical issues. I think on my end, I'm kind of off the grid and trying to log on through my cellular, and I'm having some glitches here. But I agree wholeheartedly with what Bob Hockett has laid out in terms of the foundation of why we need more so than ever a public bank and a public payment infrastructure. As far as my background goes, I am in the New York State Legislature, New York State Assembly. I've been in office since 2013, serving in my 5th term. I've been a champion of the New York State Public Bank, as well as the main sponsor of the Inclusive Value Ledger, which Bob has been the chief architect, and we've introduced at the New York State and other states, putting together similar bills as well. So you can see me, but you can't hear me through the phone. So it's a little bit of a weird.
We're making it work.
My words may not actually match. It's kind of weird.
It's all good.
It's an honor to be here, and I just want to just close the opening remarks by saying that we've had so many decades of private banking and private industry, private capital growth at a level where we're seeing the most extreme concentration of wealth on the private side at a rate that we've never witnessed in the history of humanity. So I think it only makes sense that we reclaim our ability to invest in the public sector, and the only way we can truly do that is if we take over some of the financial mechanisms that can be built better to invest in the public good. That's why it's so critical to build a public bank and a public payment infrastructure system.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm really glad we can make this solution work. So, I mean, I heard through, what all three of you guys said, that what's really game changing about public banking is the fact that we are taking finance and a sector where decisions are usually made based on profitability. Are you a person that can pay back your loan and pay it back on time, and you're usually probably wealthier and have a stable job, upper middle class, or you're a person who's a little more risky and you might not be able to pay back your loan, and hence you might have a higher interest rate. Which would a private bank choose to lend to? It's pretty clear, and Amara talked about kind of the inequities underlying our public finance, our private finance system. Can we take that system as it is today and shift it fully into the public sector, where decisions are not based on profitability, they're based on social good, what is good for the population long term, what is good for equity, what is good for our social goals. So that's really the game-changing nature of this. I know we're running short on time. I knew that 25 minutes would not be enough to cover this topic. But before we kind of, stay in the theoretical and maybe have some time to come back to the theoretical, just to really ground it, I was wondering, Bob, if you could talk to us a little bit about, we have a lot of staffers, a lot of legislators on the call with us. What is the role of a state legislature in the game of public banking? It's very, very confusing. There's a role for the federal government, state government. In New York State, we have a role for the city government. In general, what would you say is what state legislators should be focusing on if they are interested in making this public financing system a reality in their state?
Oh, great. Yeah, I can speak kind of generally. And then, of course, Ron and Amara will have a lot of great, I think, particular observations under the same heading. But as a general matter, just as a matter of just basic banking law and basic constitutional arrangements here in the U.S., each state under our federal system is a kind of quasi-sovereign, right? And while only the federal government has the money coinage authority and can issue public debt basically ad infinitum, it is nevertheless a state prerogative to charter banks, even while it's also a national prerogative. Up before the Civil War era, only the states could charter banks, right? The federal entry into the game, where we started getting so-called national banks, which are called national associations or NAs, didn't really come along into the Civil War. And when the federal role came along, it did not displace or eliminate the state role. So you've all heard about state chartered banks on the one hand and federally or nationally chartered banks on the other. These state chartered banks are creatures of state law, just like any corporation that is incorporated in a state is a creature of that state's law. Delaware corporations are creatures of Delaware state law. Most corporations, in fact, are Delaware corporations. States also have that authority to create banks, and they can determine, right, what the purposes of the banks that they charter are going to be. And they can charter private sector banks of the kind that they do now and that we see now, and they can always continue to do that. But there's nothing that prevents their doing the very same thing when it comes to public banks. They could charter a special class of banks that are specifically nonprofit, that are specifically public purpose driven, that operate as ordinary banks do in the usual sort of liability side of the balance sheet, asset side of the balance sheet sense, except that they could eliminate the profit imperative altogether. They wouldn't have to be shareholder owned, for example. They could be owned by their depositors. They could be owned by the state itself as, again, a sort of state-owned entity in sort of in the way the Bank of North Dakota operates to this very day. There's simply nothing that stops them from doing that. It's just a matter of getting the legislative will to do that. And in that connection, it seems to me that somebody like Ron, somebody like Assemblyman Kim, is a real pioneer, nationally speaking, because he's actually showing the way that you can do this in a state legislature, in the way that Amara and I and some of our colleagues have been crying and praying for people to do for many, many years now.
So what I'm hearing from you is that state legislators and legislatures have the full authority to charter a public bank should they so be willing to move in that direction. So maybe, Ron, on that note, if the legislative will is there, if the political will is there, it can be done. Can you talk a little bit about what the fight has been like in New York State so far, kind of who the allies tend to be, what is your key opposition, where we are in the fight right now? And then I'd love to hear, Amara, about this in the context of Chicago as well. I have no idea how it's going. Want to see if the same players kind of line up, allies and opposition. Would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's definitely an uphill challenge, especially in New York, when you're dealing with Wall Street politics and Wall Street Democrats that have dominated the global stage for so many years now. In fact, every single year we pay about, I think, Bob, $14 million or so of this interest on borrowed money as a government that Wall Street continues to collect. Even at the peak of the pandemic, they were still collecting, I think, billions. I think it's like $3 or $4 billion.
Billions,
worth of interest. we do need to go to a decentralized model. And when we talk about allowing municipalities, states to charter their own banks and lead with public banks, we're talking about decentralized, locally driven solutions that speak to the needs of the people on the ground. And the whole objective of money, as Bob and I have talked about this for a while, is to store and exchange value, not to extract or as much value out of our local communities. But when we have mega banks, big corporate Wall Street driving the agenda, all they're thinking about is how much can they extract from the bottom. And that's the model that we need to undo. That's why we need to go find that political courage in a place like New York, because if we do it here, then everyone else will follow.
Amara, what's it been like for you in Chicago? How is the fight shaking out?
Well, I mean, to Bob's point and to Ron's point, it definitely is an uphill battle, particularly because, I mean, Chicago is not New York by any stretch in terms of the scope of its finance sector, but in terms of the role that it plays in the Midwest, it has been, I mean, there's a huge interest in maintaining the status quo. And so I think what I can share that might be most useful for the attendees on this call is just a couple of points that people can be on the lookout for when they face these opponents, if you will. One is to recognize out front the bank lobby and the attempts to misconstrue what public banking actually is and the way that public banking interfaces with a city or a state government. We find that a lot of times the banking lobby joins together and they talk in terms of competition. And we even had a hearing here in Illinois a few months ago where it was implied that if the state moved down the path of public banking, then the banks that were being called to the carpet for the disparity in lending, some of the conversations that they were being forced essentially to have would end. That was actually implied in that conversation. And it was quite troubling because it just goes to show the unwillingness to address these systemic issues that they have that are resulting in the disparities that we're seeing, and using that as sort of almost like a threat. If you move forward with public banking, then these little efforts that we were just starting to get to will stop, right? Also, misconstruing the relationship between public banks, and the community banking ecosystem. That's something that has to be clearly articulated, both to the banking lobby, but also to the legislators, because a lot of them, we cannot assume, and I think Ron would understand this better than most, that they are clear on how a public bank would affect the local banking ecosystem. So we have to do our work to provide that information and to really handhold with our legislators so that they have a clear understanding. I think that's the work that Bob is doing. And then the last piece that I'll just offer, especially from what we did in Chicago, what we continue to do, is the need to really organize and to educate the public around what public banking is. So when I ran for office, when I ran for mayor of Chicago, it was a huge part. It was perhaps the centerpiece of the campaign, our economic platform. And it really resonates with people because when you can draw the connection between the tickets that people are being forced to pay, like the exorbitant rate of tickets, fines, fees, and forfeitures, when you also talk to people about the fact that their property taxes are increasing, when you talk to them about why we have our water infrastructure is crumbling and resulting in lead in the water in Chicago, when you talk about all of these key issues that are affecting the material conditions of people's lives, and you can link it back to systemic issues like the fact that we pay so much to private banks, that we have these bad bank deals that we negotiated with the private banks, where we have banks as depositories who don't even show up for a hearing to talk about disparity in lending. These are the things that actually resonate with the general public. And so we have to have conversations with legislators. We have to engage with experts, folks like Bob, who can handhold and provide that context and that information. But we also have to be organizing in our communities and arming our communities with the information so that they then are empowered to advocate for themselves and to say, this is what we want in our city. And that's the kind of the heavy lift, but it's the work that's absolutely essential.
Awesome. Thank you three so much for getting on this panel with me. I think we need to move this along. I would love to continue this conversation another time, but you heard it here, guys. States can create public banks. We just have to organize. We have to educate. That's it. That's all we have to do. So let's move along to the next session. Thank all of our speakers, and thank you all for being here and listening to us.